Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about this again, GH6, and we're following up my last video, or maybe 2 videos ago, on shooting in a club in a super dark situation with the GH6 and responding to some like holes in knowledge in that video. So let's get into it. So first thing I want to talk about was the gear, which I don't like talking about gear that much, but it is kind of important. So obviously the camera is the GH6 here, but the lens I mostly used was the Leica 10-25. There's a few reasons for that. One, it's one of the most handy lenses for the system. It's 1.7 aperture, it's a good zoom range for, you know, open gate, and it's even a good zoom range for when you go into that 4.4 crop mode in anamorphic. You still get wide enough, and yeah, it's just a good lens. You want a fast aperture for shooting in these situations because it's dark and a 1.7 is just about good enough. The reason I picked this lens over, I have a couple of, you know, f.95 T1 sort of lenses, but none of them are weather sealed, and with drinks and things like that, everyone having their root beers and things like that, I didn't want to risk another lens. So having a weather sealed camera and a weather sealed lens was pretty important for shooting in that environment for me. And having a zoom made things extra kind of flexible when it comes to shooting. A few other pieces of gear I want to talk about. Well, one other piece of gear was this thing. I reviewed this on the channel a while back, but after doing a few more of these types of videos, there is a cat attacking me. After doing a few more types of videos, having a light on top of your camera, I usually hate that look, but it's the look for a reason, because it's super handy to just have this light chilling on top of your camera on your hot shoe. You can bend it up and down. With the small rig light, you can kind of just like scroll it up and down for the brightness. So instead of turning it on and off, I just kind of left it on 0 and scrolled up to turn it up, and that's how I did that. So I don't know, maybe we should use this light for the rest of the video. Does it look good? I didn't bring any other stands, is the problem. So yeah, small rig light, or really any small light on top of your camera, is going to be handy. You're not going to use it all the time, but honestly, even having this at like 1 to 15% on top of your camera really helps. But we'll talk about this thing more with the rest of the comments and some of the settings when I go into that here in a minute. And quick note here, I've been doing these club videos, done like 4, 5, 6, and I have yet to encounter streaking, which is insane. Especially this like purple sign. This was like my worst nightmare for streaking, but when I look at the footage, I don't see any. So in the real world, like I've always said, it's actually pretty difficult to get that streaking effect. So I'm going to talk about kind of like hacking your camera to get a little bit more light here right now. So the big thing for me is I want to shoot probably at 24 frames a second or 23 point whatever frames a second as much as possible. And that's because you want to get a low shutter speed on your footage. So the correct one would be 1/50th, and I talk about this a little bit, but when you're shooting in that low of light of a situation, it might be worth it. Oh my God, this cat is losing his mind. Look at this thing. All right, so when you're shooting in low light, you're gonna want as slow of a shutter speed as possible usually. And to get a correct shutter speed of 180 degrees, you're usually looking at 24 frames a second is gonna give you the lowest one. 25 would be pretty close too. So the reason I say you can kind of hack it is because you can go even lower than that if you know what you're doing. So sometimes I'll just go to 1/40th or even, you know, you don't want to go, you can't go any lower than 1/25th, because that's going to kind of mess with your, you know, frame rate, because you're going to start dropping frames. But there's quite a few shots in the previous video that are that are 1/25th of a second and still look okay. Sometimes getting that correct exposure is a little bit more important than getting the correct motion blur. That's why you see a lot of those old club videos, I feel like, from the, you know, olden days when cameras were so much worse in low light, where you get that like stuttery frame rate, super low shutter speed look. And that's, you know, I thought it was just a style, but it's probably more likely that it was out of necessity. And so that's a cool style to do, and it is kind of stylistic. So in a pinch, you know, if you go to 1/40th, you're getting a third stop extra light without really sacrificing much of your correct motion blur. But any lower than that, you're getting into a stylistic look. Ah! I'm just gonna be playing with this toy for the rest of the time, so don't mind me. But so the next thing a lot of people were asking about that I realized I didn't really mention was white balance, because it's pretty wacky lighting in these places most of the time, right? So, you know, what is gonna be your general settings for white balance? So there's a few things I do. Step one is just scroll through those presets, you know. Look at daylight, see how that looks. Look at, you know, tungsten, see how that looks. Things like that. And if none of those are really working out, I go to step two, which is gonna be some kind of like custom white balance. So you can't exactly pop out a gray card in the middle of a club and be like, what's, you know, let's get a reading, because the lighting isn't usually a typical white balance setting like daylight or things like that. It's usually gonna be, you know, blue or pink or red or green or some crazy colors. What I'll typically do is kind of just split the difference, you know, this light's looking a little cool, this light's looking a little warm. Instead of setting it to like 3,000 something or like 5,000 something, oh my gosh, I'll usually just kind of set the camera to maybe like 4,000 or 4,500 on the Kelvin scale. And that way, if a daylight light comes up, it's gonna be a little cool. If a tungsten light comes up, it's gonna be a little bit warm, but they're always gonna be in the ballpark. If it's close, it's close. I kind of just let it ride, see what happens, and there you go. Now let's talk about autofocus. That's another reason I like this setup in particular, is because of that, I'm gonna toss the cat toy for a second, clutch, you know. I'll usually set this thing to somewhere near infinity as a general rule, and then slap it back. And that way I'm using autofocus a lot, you know, one area plus. I can pretty easily change the size, and that works out pretty well. The autofocus on this is a lot better than my original S5. S5 Mark II might be better, but I know Phase Detect struggles in low light as well occasionally. But yeah, this way I can hold down my shutter, which I've disabled, or if you haven't disabled it, you can half hold it down, get things in focus, start rolling, or you can even do that while you're rolling. But if autofocus is totally messing up, pop this back, you know you're at somewhere between 5 feet and infinity, which is where you're probably gonna be working most of the time anyway. And then you can manual focus. I have the front button here set for that live punch in if you have the GH6, and I can check my focus. I've got peaking up on the D-pad back here, and usually on in general. And so just being able to be like autofocusing, continuous autofocusing, holding the button down to make it autofocus even faster, pulling the clutch back to get it into manual focus if the autofocus is acting up, and then using the button on the back here or the button on the front here to either turn on and off peaking or punch in on the focus. There's just like a million ways to manually and autofocus with this thing. And so that really helped, as opposed to the S5, which, you know, we'll take the S5 out for a spin on some of these low light shoots and see if it's any better than the GH6. But yeah, that's a few of my focus settings for shooting in like a club or really dark situation that's been helping me out. Again, I used V-Log just because I want that extra color flexibility, but I'm sure Natural or Cine D, you know, some of those others would be plenty fine. Generally, they just have a little bit more noise reduction. You know, put in by default that you might be able to turn down a lot, but I'm not sure if you can turn it all the way off. And they are fine. They just hide the noise. I don't think they're really that much better in noise, with noise than Vlog, but that's what people say. So, you know, more testing required. One thing I would like to try maybe on the next show I do is shooting in HLG, because I know on the GH5S, HLG is crazy clean. Like, I almost couldn't get noise to show up at HLG on the GH5S, which was crazy. So, yeah, if you have a profile you prefer working in, any of those would be fine. Maybe better than Vlog, but I like the LUTs and the flexibility for Vlog, so whatever. And one thing I did try on another thing, which I might have included in this video, on another shoot, is turning the noise reduction up a little bit in Vlog. So I would probably stick between plus 2.5 to plus 5 to see just what happens there, but I don't know. I really think Neat Video does a way better job. So if you're gonna do that, might just stick with Neat Video. So anyway, guys, those are some of my thoughts and tips and takeaways and responding from comments and whatever on my last ultra low light video with the GH6, and hopefully this fills in a few little gaps in knowledge that video might have left. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.